And welcome to Spirit Plant Medicine Monthly. We're really quite excited about the latest changes going on in the world today. Things are changing here in British Columbia, where we are located, and we're excited to really be bringing our Spirit Plant Medicine Conference back to life in November. And we thought it would be a great time to, really start off April and get back to sharing the knowledge and information about psychedelics as a healing option for people who are looking to transform their lives. And it gives me great excitement today to really introduce a guest who I'm proud to even call a friend now, because we've spent so many years together in the work that we're doing, and it's just happy to share this gentleman's work. Now, Tom Hatsis is an actual historian of witchcraft, magic, Western religions, contemporary psychedelia, entheogens, and medieval pharmacopeia. He's published The Witch's Ointment, The Secret History of Psychedelic Magic, the first study to how to address medieval witches from the Renaissance magicians utilizing psychedelics and entheogenic drugs in their magical systems. He's also wrote a great book called Microdosing Magic, and which is a psychedelic spell book, and his psychedelic mystery traditions. Tom is a derby gypsy. He considers himself a juggler, musician, and a potion mixer. He also skates throughout the global derby world, dodging police, visiting rare archives, swinging elixirs, and coaching roller derby. Tom, always a pleasure to have you anywhere related to spirit plant medicine. It's one of those things where you're just one of my favorite people who are always entertaining and super knowledgeable. So welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mark. It's so great to be here. I absolutely love every time we get together. Well, one thing I got to point out, you said that it sounded like you're saying you now can consider me a friend. I know it. Friends for years.
Yeah, I do. It's funny when I introduce an actual guest, and then I realize, holy smokes, we're actually friends.
Yeah. I was going to say, you sat in what, like 10 hours of traffic to come down and help us out with our conference 2 years ago.
Absolutely. Well, but that's the beauty of the work that we do, right? It's something that who would have ever known who you meet? And, you talk about that in your new book, which is what we're going to talk about as we get going. But who would have thought I'd meet you, that I'd meet guys like Dennis McKenna and Paul Stamets when I first started getting into plants as actual medicine for transformation, for healing, for spiritual awarenesses, expanding consciousness for that matter. And, so sometimes I just get caught up. Yes, I do definitely consider you a good friend, and it's a pleasure to be on this journey with you. So thank you so much for bringing your gift to the world and especially in the unique way that you bring it, because the thing that I love is you are so fun, easygoing, and knowledgeable in terms of, the subject matter at hand. And today we're, in honor of Bicycle Day, we're going to talk about your recent book, LSD, The Wonder Child, Golden Age of Psychedelic Research in the 50s. I got to say, I just finished it because I like to be fresh on the books when I read them and I have these conversations. And one of the things I really loved about it, part of me, I'll be honest with you, I was like, oh, psychedelic research, intellectual deep dive and things of that nature. But you made it really fun to read. Yes, there was a lot of names, a lot of dates, and a lot of things going on, but it was fun to read. I was enthralled the way you connected everything, and in your, just your style of writing, so that, even guys like me can understand and stick with it, because, there's times, sometimes these, scientific type books and things of research and things can be a little dry, right? And yours certainly wasn't. So I thank you for a great job on that.
Well, thanks. I learned my lesson writing The Witch's Ointment, which was very dry. And it's the book, as you point, I mean, it's based on a medical history. And how do you make, a medical history? How do you make like medical papers and academic journals interesting to people? And so I tried to tell stories. and say, like, here's the story that surrounded this particular medical study. So I looked at like letters and correspondences between different researchers to say, well, what were they saying around this study? What was happening outside of it? Like, here's what they sent to the, the press for publication, but what was going on? Like, what was the crazy things that were happening, and sometimes not so crazy, and everything in between, that created this particular academic article. And so I hope that does come across.
Well, it did for me. And, before we dive into some of the really interesting things in there, I gotta say, I thought it was hilarious because as I started reading it, you had me hooked when you started talking about your talk at Spirit Plant Medicine in 2017.
Yeah.
And how you met Martin A. Lee, and
yeah.
You're walking around and things. And I was just like, hey, that's when I met Tom. That's so awesome. And I was just like, excited to see how it came so close to home. And then even as I kept reading, like the amount of research that was happening right here in Canada and in Vancouver in our backyard was really quite mesmerizing to me. I knew there was some stuff being done, but not to the degree that our country was actually involved in what was happening in this whole renaissance when it came down to LSD.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially the more spiritual side of the LSD experience being pushed by Al Hubbard in Vancouver, especially. That was a big thing that was happening in the 1950s. And I think that I mentioned two different times that I got to speak at Spirit Plant Medicine Conference. The first was on the witch's ointments. Oh wait, no, that was the same year. Oh my God. Yeah, never mind. It was the same year that I ate mushrooms before my talk on the witch's ointment. And that was the year that I also met Martin A. Lee. And I'd been a fan of his Acid Dreams was one of the first books on psychedelia I ever read. And I couldn't believe that the two of us, I mean, he was like, hey, you want to go smoke a joint? And that was my first time at UBC. And so Martin and I are walking around the campus smoking a joint. And all of a sudden we were like, holy shit, we don't know how to get back to the Buchanan A building. Like, we were totally lost, like two lost stoners.
UBC can be like that for one.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. No, totally amazing. And I just love the way you connected that in the beginning of the book, because it really kind of landed home for me. And, I certainly thank you for the reference, especially, we're coming up to, having our 11th in-person event in November with the mandates lifting here in British Columbia. So we're excited about that. And just having, the community come back together in a way that creates, stronger connection versus, this Zoom universe and this digital universe. Now, that being said, I'm really grateful for it because it's been a lot of opportunity. There's been a lot of growth in virtual events and things of that nature. And the benefit that I see with that is the ability to bring people together who can't necessarily always be able to travel and partake in these events, maybe full time to that degree, but it can bring people in from all over the world and they can participate. And to me, that's always exciting for me.
Absolutely. But there's nothing like going up to British Columbia and, getting to give you a big hug and give Stephen a big hug and see everybody and, feel that energetic connection, because we really especially at Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, I mean, you guys really create and maintain and hold space, and we all get to do that, and we all get to participate in that form of medicine work. And I mean, I've been to a lot of different psychedelic conferences, but there's something about SPMC in particular where you feel like you're doing medicine work when you're there. I mean, it's really remarkable how the whole thing is put together, and the opening ceremonies, the closing ceremonies, of course, the Sunday sermon from Chris Killam is is always one of the things that I look forward to, like every single year. So but I feel you on the Zoom thing. I don't want us to ever lose our human connection with each other.
Absolutely.
The Zoom conference thing is cool, and Zoom talks like this are awesome. And I'm psyched that, people get to participate who otherwise, if I were just giving this talk in Portland, a lot of people that don't live nearby wouldn't be able to make it. And in this sense, we get to interact with people from all over the world, wherever they're coming from. So it's always, it's about, I think, finding that balance.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why we're excited to, excuse me, offer a hybrid event this year where we are going to do a virtual thing like we did in 2020 when you helped us out. And that was an experience unlike no other from a virtual conference point of view. And, so we're excited to bring both worlds together from being live in person and being a virtual hybrid event so that people can still join us on Zoom, as well as even on the live stream page like they're watching today in our membership portal. So, we're pretty excited about that. But hey, let's dive into your book because, it's been a couple of days since the official bicycle day.
Yeah.
And we just had 420 yesterday as well. Mm-hmm. So first, I want to thank you just for your time, for being available, because I figured you'd probably be pretty busy on the subject of LSD and Bicycle Day. But man, I love how your book started to, when you kind of went into this early history of, in medieval times and in the, early centuries with the ergot and where LSD kind of, is derived from, and how that, the psychosis, they would describe it being induced by this rotten grain, created its own pandemic back in those days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, yeah, maybe you can share something about that because, it's not like LSD just magically appeared. There was a reason and there's a history behind it before it even got pharmaceuticalized, right?
Oh, yeah. There were a whole bunch of ergot-derived medicines coming out for a variety of reasons. Ergotamine was just one of them that was used to stop bleeding in the lungs. Medieval wise women had been using ergot for centuries to help facilitate birth, to increase the to both increase the process of birth and stop the postpartum hemorrhaging that women would experience. And so there was a variety. I mean, I go over the different, some of them, there were so many of them, but I go over a handful of them in the book. Ergot was also synthesized into a medicine called hydrogen that would stifle senility in the elderly. So it had all of these different uses. And the fact that, just take the name LSD 25, that means that Albert Hofmann had synthesized this thing 24 different ways before hitting on what we know as LSD. So what I'm curious about, well, what was LSD 14 like? Did right? Anybody ever try LSD 14 or 15 or 20 or 2, and what might those medicines actually be like? And it was, the whole thing was so fortuitous because Hofmann had actually had offers from different laboratories all over Switzerland to work, but Sandoz, which is where he was working when he synthesized LSD, or the different 25 different syntheses of it, that was the only one at the time that allowed him to work with natural substances. And Hofmann was every bit the natural philosopher as he was a chemist. And I think that a lot of chemists go into the field for that reason. There's that magic of working with natural substances and kind of unweaving Mother Gaia's handiwork. How did she stitch together this beautiful nature, this creation all around us? And thankfully, Albert Hofmann was there to do it. And he had tested in 1938 LSD 25, and it didn't have any noticeable results or anything significant about it. And so whatever possessed him to reopen the case in 1943, again, to use that word fortuitous, because at Sandoz Laboratories, I found out Once a substance had been discarded as being, that we're not going to use this, it was never again synthesized except for LSD 25.
Well, and what an interesting fact, because, just as you say, what was LSD 14 like? What was LSD 11 like? What was, how many great products or pharmaceuticals were created that have never even reached it to, for healthcare today. And not that I'm a big proponent necessarily of pharmaceuticals, even though I do believe they have their place. The most important thing for me is that, it's all derived from plants, right? Everything that they do in the labs all comes from some sort of, scientific or historic, you look at ancient Chinese medicine and herbal medicine and, what they've been using throughout the ages, not just in China, but around the world, and how these things were able to, create better health for so many people in different ailments. And to me, that was fascinating. And as you get moving forward and you talk about him, coming back to it, I think it was like 5 years later.
Yeah.
Right. And then I thought it was an interview when I was reading.
6 years, I think.
6 years, yeah.
38 to 43. 41.
So then he tells the story about him making some more, and then he had some sort of an effect, but he was like, well, lab's clean. What happened? Where did it come from? He went to the chloroform, everything that he handled before he actually, sampled it himself in that way.
Yeah.
And which leads us to Bicycle Day, which what we're talking about, which just starts a whole nother conversation in regards to the history of this research.
Yeah, absolutely. The first accidental dose of LSD occurred on April 16th, which was a Friday. And he felt a little dizzy and he went home from work, and he had, 2 days, Saturday and Sunday, to think about, well, what was that? And when he went back to his laboratory, I mean, he, like, LSD 25, being the cause of his feelings, 3 days prior, was the last thing on his mind. Mm-hmm. And when he took, when he finally settled on, he's like, okay, he tried everything else. And he's like, okay, I guess the only thing it could be is LSD 25. And he took what he believed to be an infinitesimal amount, which was 250 millionths of a gram. And just to give everyone an idea of how large, because we say 250 millionths of a gram, but what does that really translate to, in just regular terms? What that means is take, a sharpened pencil, dot a piece of paper, and cut that dot in half. That is 250 millionths of one half of that would be 250 millionths of a gram. So that's why it was like everybody was shocked, and his boss didn't even believe him when he phoned him and said, look, this extraordinary thing happened to me taking LSD 25. And his boss, Arthur Stoll, asked him, well, how much did you take? And Hofmann said 250 millionths of a gram. And he's like, get the fuck out. Oh, excuse me. Get out of here. There's no way. There's no way that could have caused that. And then he ended up eating his words because he tried that much. He's like, oh my goodness. And he actually took, he had two experiences. His boss did. The first one was, took him into, he was soaring angelic, as Humphrey Osmond famously wrote, and the second time he was fathoming hell. And he became the second, and Ernest Rothland became the third, and then Susie Romstein, who was Albert Hofmann's lab assistant, she was the one who actually got on a bicycle with him on Bicycle Day and was, guiding him. So she's riding her bike, and Hofmann, and she has one hand on her handlebars and another hand on Albert Hofmann, and he's all up in the cosmos. And she's like, oh, like, you got to pay attention. Like, you're going to crash into, a tree or something. And she actually took the largest dose. She was the first person to deliberately take like a very large dose of LSD.
Wow.
And she was like 21 at the time.
So maybe we can put it in perspective in another way too. If 250, did you say millionths of a gram?
Millions, yeah.
Millionths of a gram, like that's even hard to even conceive the size of it.
Yeah.
What would that be today in what we would consider a average dose, or the 100 micrograms of a, as a blotter or something like that?
So that's a great question. I live in Portland, Oregon now, but I'm originally from New York. And in New York, we had 250 millions to 300 millions of a gram. That was how we took our LSD. We didn't realize like that is an insane amount of LSD. And I got to Portland, and everybody measured, or at least the people I know, measure their tabs out to 100 milligrams of LSD. And so I got here and I tried the LSD and I'm like, what the hell is this? Like, where, where we like, I need two of these to get the effect I used to have. Not to say that 100 is not a lot, because it is, it just wasn't what I was used to.
Yeah, and it takes me back to when I think about, my introduction to it back in the mid 80s, early 80s, actually, because, there were things like the double barrels and everything was a double.
Yeah, gel tabs.
Exactly. We used to get these things like look like a little pencil lead. And it was purple, and they called it the purple double barrel. Or there was the orange microdot that looked like a little flying saucer, right? But had I known I'd be here having this conversation with you today, 50 or 40 years later, who would have known? But I certainly had my experience at a young age. And, I find it fascinating because as, they discovered the power of this medicine and how the effect of such an infinitesimal amount can have such profound effects, and then as they got into the research from a psychiatric point of view, what led into the CIA and everything else. But like you were talking about the people having such opposed experiences necessarily, and even in the same experience, they can experience hell, they experience heaven, within the same experience. And I found it really interesting in regards to the research, how, again, what we always come back to in the psychedelic field is set and setting, right? And, how they were looking at it as, from the, I think you coined it, or we're talking about it as like that, that mad state. They'd have a taste of what it would be like to be crazy. And this way they were identifying with the experience they were having in the beginning.
Sure. And we have mostly two different people on two sides of the pond to thank for the idea of setting. On our side of the pond, there was an American psychologist named Juliana Day. Juliana Day was the first person to recognize, at least according to the medical literature, that the role of the psychologist or the psychiatrist and the setting of the room had so much to do with the person's experience under LSD. So she doesn't get enough credit for having done that. But it all started actually really simply, like what we consider setting started with Juliana Day literally adjusting the Venetian blinds in the exam room, because different dots, so the sun would be coming through windows, and the person on LSD would kind of be going like this, and the other doctors are all like with their, oh well, why is this person reacting to the sun? And Juliana says, because the goddamn sun's in their eyes. Like, what are you talking about? The same way, anybody would react to this. So she always made it a point to, if she noticed that the patient was kind of going like this from the window, she would adjust the blind so that the sun wouldn't be in their face. Or if they started having some kind of traumatic experience, and the other doctor's like, oh, this person is crying. So she would reach for the Kleenex and comfort that person. And that was really, at least in the States, that was the beginning of setting. As humble as those origins are, that's how it began. Now, across the pond in England, you had guys like Ronald Sanderson at Powick Hospital. He worked with two other researchers, and they set up an LSD block. And that as well within Powick Hospital. And that LSD block, of course, had very humble settings. Like they had a couch, for example. And that, we think today, like, of course you'd have a couch in case the person needs the person needs to lie down or something. And no, they didn't think of that at the time. They also had a chalkboard. so that the person could, draw while they were in the exam room. And we all think, yeah, of course, like I like to have crayons and magic markers when I take LSD. Yeah. Well, at the time, this is going back to 1952, nobody thought of that. And eventually their LSD block, it grew into, they had little games, they had a small petting zoo, there was a river, or rather a stream by Poway Hospital. They would let their LSD patients go, wade around in the stream. Yeah, they just like this, that's how this whole thing started, like with setting. And nobody really had considered that until Juliana Day did in the States, and Ronald Sanderson's team had over at Poway Hospital. There was something else you had mentioned I wanted to also touch upon, and it's escaping me at the moment. I apologize.
That's okay. Well, there's so much to talk about here. I thought we could go on and have a conversation. Like some of these guys, is same kind of thing. It's like some people wanted to have that mystical experience as, time went on. And then some people wanted to have the deep philosophical discussion,
Well, that's the thing. In a lot of these cases, a lot of the doctors weren't even trying to pursue the deep mystical experience, but people were having them anyway. And in some cases, somebody was having a mystical experience and the doctor would be talking them out of it because they didn't realize, oh, LSD, and indeed all of these medicines, puts you in deep touch with a larger spiritual reality. A colleague of ours, Martin Beisch, published his book, LSD and the Mind of the Universe. I think that was 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how handy would that have been back in the 1950s to have a book like that? I mean, in the early 1950s, they didn't even have Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception yet. So they were really, they were kind of shooting in the dark with all of this.
Well, they were like true pioneers, especially within the Western realm of psychedelic work, because I love how in the book you also brought in, I was fascinated to read about, I learned a lot, man. Thank you so much from the history of what you put in there. But just the work they were doing with mescaline at the time, right? Yeah. And then how they came in side by side in terms of the work that was being done. Yet when we look at the mescaline being a derivative peyote, San Pedro, Peruvian torch, the cactus, and how the indigenous people for thousands of years have been using these sacraments for, I don't even call it religion, but it's for spiritual, connection to source, really.
Sure. I mean, in some cases, it can be called religious because there are proscribed rituals around it. But I mean, religion and spirit, I mean, they're so difficult to define. But I think
I like to keep it simple. I'll just want to interject one way, and this is just me. I don't mean to offend anyone. I always see religion as kind of like an organized business of blame and shame and fear, and spirituality is very different, where it's open, it's about oneness, and it's all inclusive in that sense. So that's where I usually define the difference between the two, not to take away from, what I learned and experienced growing up as a Catholic school kid or anything like that. But, it's just how I see the difference in that anyway. So.
Sure. Sure. Absolutely. With those mescaline studies and the later LSD studies, I mean, getting back to the whole idea of set and setting, you have something like mescaline, and you have indigenous cultures, First Nations cultures, using it for spiritual or religious, however we want to define it. We're talking about the same thing. We're talking about connection to source. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. So you have First Nations peoples using it for that reason. And then you have, in World War II, you have the Nazis using it to torture people. And then you bring it back after that to the United States and in Canada, and people are using it for psychological aids in therapy. So I think that what that shows is how much the set and setting really is dependent on these medicines. And then it's weird because at the same time, you can also make the case that some of these doctors who did not care about the spiritual experience at all, and like I said a moment ago, would even just kind of dismiss it, and yet their volunteers were having straight up mystical and spiritual experiences, even though that wasn't even the point of, you know, the clinical trial, so to speak, or the examination. But that keeps coming up in the literature, in the medical literature. The amount of times that there is a reference to some kind of spiritual idea is quite staggering, specifically when we consider that that's not even what the doctors were looking for. And unfortunately, in some cases, had there been a trained facilitator there, we would have much more interesting medical documents. I'll give you just one example. One of the first people to work with LSD in the United States was a guy named Max Wrinkle, who worked at the Boston Psychopathic Hospital in Massachusetts. And in one case, one of his volunteers mentioned how a thermostat on the wall had turned into a crucifix. And he completely just dismissed that as some kind of hallucination. But if he would have pursued that and said, oh, what does that mean for you? You know, are you a Christian? Are you not a Christian? Like, in whatever, I don't know the exact, the specifications of that person's spiritual or religious ideology. But had Dr. Wrinkle pursued that, his write-up of the test probably would have been very different. But instead it was like, oh, this is just a hallucination. No, what if this person was experiencing some kind of Christ consciousness? I'm sorry, every now and then my New York accent comes out, even though I live on the West Coast now. But I'm trying to correct it. But, had he, pursued that, we would, have something very different to look at. And the later doctors, after the Doors of Perception came out, started to pursue those lines of questioning, and it's all over the medical research. In fact, the first LSD therapeutic manual, written by a guy named Duncan Blewett, it has Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. I just went to New York again and said perception all over it. And it's interesting to see how influential that essay actually was, and how influential Maria Huxley was in creating Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. And we could get into that too if you'd like, because it's one of my favorite topics in this whole, area of 1950 psychedelia.
Well, it's amazing to just see how all these great minds came together in such different ways. And what always strikes me is anytime, I always look for patterns in everything. If that pattern is consistent through time, doesn't matter what we do. And you see that in these studies where this mystical experience always comes up. There's a pattern. Now, not everybody had it. And sometimes people would have it on, after multiple journeys or different setting, different practitioners. But there was that underlying repetition of very similar experiences, as well as the experience of experiencing their birth, which I've never had that experience myself, but my goodness, it's like I could only imagine what that would be like. And you describe it very well in your book from a couple of the reports from some of these doctors. And it also, I found quite interesting, is how these doctors were really eager and curious to experience, this LSD 25, what they call it. How do you say the word? Delicid?
Delicid.
Yeah. What Sandoz was calling it as they were producing it, and how eager people they'd hear about it. And it's like, oh my God, they have to experience and look into this, and how it created that domino effect in terms of more research and, just this desire to really want to dose everybody.
Sure. Well, Sandoz, when they sent out samples of LSD, they put in their pamphlet, do not give this to anyone until you take it yourself. So but almost every doctor who worked with LSD had taken LSD themselves. And as far as, wanting to put it everywhere, I had mentioned Duncan Blewett a moment ago. He famously, he wanted to put LSD in every gumball machine in America. He said there should be gumball machines
Exactly.
that have LSD in them. And, that's how just exciting the research was at the time, until, it all kind of went south. But I mean, the point I was trying to make with the book was that there was a time when LSD was considered a wonder child, and that's what, hence the title, and not this horror drug that it's seen as, today, or not so much today. You also bear in mind that this book is based off of my master's thesis, which was written, almost 20 years ago, or closer to 15 years ago. And let's see, what was it? Yeah, about closer to 15 years ago. And in those days, I mean, LSD was still seen as this horrible thing. I mean, now obviously the current is changing because of a lot of people like what you do with Spirit Plant Medicine Conference, and the fact that, I mean, you just can't deny the medical literature. I mean, these were objective, conservative doctors running these tests in very dull clinical settings, and people were still reporting these extraordinary experiences.
Yeah. All I can say is yeah to that, because I just think back of everything I read, and there was just time after time, experience after experience. Well, now let's backtrack a little bit and talk about your favorite subject. That's Huxley's book. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, yeah, one of my favorite subjects about it is how influential Maria Huxley was. So there's two things about the Doors of Perception that I think need to be said in our day. They kind of should be brought to light. One, and you'll know this because you read the book, is that we tend to think, people that are familiar with Humphrey Osmond coming to Los Angeles, giving Aldous Huxley mescaline for the first time, we tend to think that there were only three people present: Aldous, of course, Maria, and Humphrey. But the fact is, there was one more person present, and her name was Annie Wesley. She was one of Maria Huxley's closest and best friends, who was a Black woman. And because of that, unfortunately, and this, I struggle with this a lot because I'm a fan of Aldous Huxley, but she was present, and she is not mentioned anywhere in the Doors of Perception for, the time. I mean, the 1950s in America was a very racist time. In fact, Aldous Huxley wasn't even wearing dress pants. He was wearing blue jeans. And it was Maria who said, you can't be dressed like a slob, for your audience. You have to say that you were wearing, dress pants instead. And so that's in the book. I mean, he talks about the folds in his trousers, but he wasn't wearing trousers. He was wearing blue jeans. And I discovered a letter that Aldous Huxley had written to Humphrey Osmond, where he mentions Annie Wesley, who was one of his assistants and one of Maria Huxley's very good friends, who was also there at the time. So I want to say that I think that needs to be mentioned, that, because of the culture at the time, she was written out of the narrative. Now, something else that wasn't exactly written out of the essay itself, The Doors of Perception, but a lot of people kind of skirt past, is that while Aldous and Humphrey were talking about we're talking about mescaline in this very clinical medical way, Maria was just bored to tears, and she was just like, oh my goodness, like this is awful. You're on this amazing medicine. I mean, she didn't call it a medicine, but you're on this amazing substance. Like, how about this? Instead of focusing on the medical aspect, try to focus your mind on what the Tibetan Buddhists call the clear light. And in the 1960s, when we start to see all of this Far Eastern Buddhist imagery, especially promoted by guys like Timothy Leary, Well, where did Leary get it from? Well, he got it from Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception. But where did Aldous Huxley get it from? He got it from Maria.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a mention in the book that Maria was the one who actually suggested and recommended Huxley, do this journey, right? Wasn't she the influence behind him making that decision? I may be confused with someone else, because there's a lot of doctors going through this book, man.
There's nuance. You're correct about that. So the story is that Aldous Huxley had invited Humphrey Osmond to stay at their home because he wanted to speak to him about taking mescaline. And after a few days of neither Aldous Huxley or Humphrey Osmond bringing it up, you are correct, Mark. It was Maria that was finally like, oh my God, like, let's get on with this. Like, you invited this guy here to take mescaline. You literally wrote in your letter, oh, could you please bring some mescaline? And let's get on with this already. So you're correct. It's weird. It was both. There's nuance there. He invited Humphrey Osmond there, but he kind of got cold feet once Humphrey Osmond arrived, and Maria was nudging him like, come on, just let's do this already.
Yeah. So interesting to see, how things were done so differently not so long ago. Right. Just from the, the way science and everything connected. And I think of a clinical environment. Last place I'd want to be on an LSD journey myself, but needless to say. So let's shift serious gears here, because what really blew me away too is, I'm familiar with, MK Ultra. I've seen some documentaries. I've read a little bit, but to the extent that the CIA and the government were involved in what was going on, blew my mind. And their willingness to just dose damn near anybody and everybody.
Yeah. One of the interesting things, though, that at least I find interesting, when Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MK Ultra, was put on trial, there were two trials, 1975 and 1977. I don't remember which one it was at specifically, but while sitting on the stand and while he was getting grilled, by Robert Kennedy over this, he said, you know what? If history had gone another way, I could easily see myself sitting on this stand being grilled as to why we didn't conduct these tests. And I think that speaks to a larger way that governments do go about gathering information. And how they will actually, the United States government funded this, and that they turned around and threw all these guys under the bus. I'm not saying what they did was ethical or moral, because it absolutely was not. And some people make the excuse that, moral and ethical guidelines regarding human testing were not as up to date as they are today. Yes, they were. We had the Nuremberg Code at that point. Along with other medical protocols that said, you shouldn't do exactly what MK Ultra did. But I also feel that Sidney Gottlieb was right about that, and that, they would have been put on trial if history had gone a different way, and, the Ruskies had taken over and forced their way of life on, the rest of the world, that they would have been put on trial for not having conducted these tests. And again, that's not to excuse it. It's to show that there is a deeper problem of immorality with the way governments go about gathering this kind of information.
And let's just say, I just want to interject there, because I think it's important, is not just a government, but that's also street level recreational kind of things that happen where the morality is lost in terms of what's been discovered to the potential of these medicines. And it's like anything, like we see the legalization of cannabis here in Canada and different parts of the States, where all of a sudden there's the healing and the health, and then there's the money and the business and everything else in between. Right.
Yeah. Like famously at Woodstock, don't eat the brown acid.
Yeah.
No, because there are bad actors out there. Absolutely there are bad actors. And I mean, this went on in Canada as well. I mean, there were some tests done up in Canada that were less than ethical and far less than moral.
Well, in the psychiatric hospitals and things like that in Saskatchewan, and what you're describing is like, just makes you almost cringe thinking that, especially, when you're dealing with psychotic patients and people who are schizophrenic and having other ailments, to throw that on top of it, to me, doesn't seem to make sense, even though I understand what they were looking to achieve, to break that cycle or to open that up so that they could have a semblance of a normal life, right?
Sure. Not so much at Saskatchewan. I would say more at McGill. That's where there were some pretty, let's call it worthy of CIA morality LSD tests occurred. There's a great book called In the Sleep Room that goes over all that stuff. As far as what happened at Saskatchewan, you had pretty, at least from my perspective, ethical and moral guys like Abram Hoffer, Humphrey Osmond, and such, who really did care about their volunteers and did go out of their way to make sure that they weren't violating any kinds of ethical standards.
Good to know. Thanks for that clarification. The other thing that I thought was really quite interesting about the whole government CIA MK Ultra thing is how, they start looking at it as a truth serum, right? And then, and this is the interesting nature of this medicine, because set and setting, now all of a sudden it's a secret repressant. They're looking at two different, like completely opposite sides of the coin with the same, with the same medicine, with the same chemical, right?
Yeah, I mean, and what that proves to me is that these medicines are not weapons. They are medicines. And I just, again, want to just reiterate, I am not justifying or validating some of the awful experiments that took place under MK Ultra. So, if anyone's like, oh, are you, justifying any of this, I'm not at all. It was horrible what happened. I just think that it goes deeper than just saying the CIA, or, because before the CIA even existed, you had things like Project Chatter, where that was run by the US Navy. And I mean, they would torture people under mescaline and caffeine and cannabis. Three things that I happen to like as medicines, not as ways to torture people. So it just, I just want to make that point that it goes deeper than CIA. And
absolutely.
It's more of a corruption of the souls of certain institutions.
Well said on that. I just thought it was fascinating because you laid it out pretty good, connecting a lot of the dots in there, that just opened up my eyes even more to the craziness that, of course, I certainly don't condone by any stretch, yet interesting nonetheless. So what happened? How did it change to the point? Because there was that turning point where it almost became more mystical and spiritually applied than necessarily, from a psychiatric point of view, even though they were still both going on. What ended up happening towards, the end of the 50s, because all of a sudden Hollywood got involved and there's some politicians involved, and everything I read in the book, they were reporting about the mystical experience, the oneness, the feeling of connected to a higher source versus necessarily a psychiatric type benefit for themselves, even though that experience is exactly what that is.
Yeah, again, I think that all goes back to the doors of perception, at least in the States at the time. And over in England, I would credit Dr. Margaret Kuttner, who had joined the team that Ronald Sanderson had put together at Powick Hospital. And she was the one who started to recognize that what other people were calling hallucinations, she was like, these are Jungian archetypes. And one of those being just a spiritual experience. And so it took people like Margaret Kuttner and Maria Huxley through Aldous writing The Doors of Perception to rediscover the spiritual side of these things. I mean, because in the West, we have spiritual experiences with the psychedelics and entheogens going all the way back to the days of Eleusis, the rites of Eleusis. And I would argue they go back even before that with the Minoans and the worship of the opium goddess. So it took certain people to, these medicines, as I've called, not me, but Stanislav Grof has called them, and I've quoted him to like effect, they are non-specific amplifiers. And so it really does matter what the cultural context surrounding that experience looks like to end up defining the experience. Andy Letcher wrote a great book, Shroom, A Cultural History of the Magic Mushroom, which essentially argues that point, and I happen to agree with him.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it's the one thing I've learned through my own, studies and experience, is just that, if you're not ready, and this is why set and setting is so important, if you're having a bad day, don't go do psychedelics, and then wonder why you had a bad trip. And then people don't understand dosage and things of that nature. And if you're not prepared for what you're about to experience, that could certainly be, something that's going to freak someone out. And I've seen it happen with some people, thank God, not very often. But it's always comes down to a point of not being ready, not being aware of dosage, set and setting, and how, even in the book, everything, when you have especially the clinical trials and things, there was at least a safety involved, right?
Absolutely. And I would add to that, I think the overriding paradigm that makes the most difference is trusting the medicine, because I eat high doses of mushrooms, and I've eaten high doses of mushrooms when I've had a bad day or a bad week, and I've never had a bad trip in my life, because at least for me and my own, and this, is getting into, spirituality and mushrooms and stuff, but just to say that for me, when I eat mushrooms, I don't see them as anything else other than a vector, a way to communicate with my goddess. If you can't tell by the altar behind me, that I'm kind of blocking, so maybe you can't see it right now.
I can see it. Yeah.
But I am a goddess worshiper, and when I eat mushrooms, or LSD for that matter, or mescaline or anything, I trust that these are doing nothing more than putting me into that infinite space where anybody can experience that kind of source consciousness, for lack of a better way of putting it. I don't normally use the word source consciousness, but I know that a lot of people do. So just so that we're, kind of.
And there's so many ways that we can, say that, and, without offending people of what they believe. But I think it's just a kind of a great way to encompass it all. And I agree with you. I personally have never had a bad trip as well. I know my older brother did when we were teenagers one time. He never go back. Don't really know exactly what was going on with him, but we were young and it was recreational. So I can understand, though I've never had that placement, because I also trust myself. I trust my own consciousness that I can handle anything that I'm gonna, do to myself.
Yeah, but we also we do something today that is kind of new in the long history of psychedelic use. And that's, we draw this very fine line between spiritual and recreational. And that's not something that has always existed. I would just, as the most popular example, the ancient rites of Dionysus. They were both spiritual, but they were recreational as well. And back in the day when I lived in New York, friends of mine and I mean, we would drive up to Lake George and we would build a bonfire on the beach, and we'd eat mushrooms and ecstasy, and we'd roll joints, and we'd break out the drums and the flutes and the guitars, and we would just be dancing around this large bonfire. I mean, is that recreational? Yes. But were we also connecting with each other and with nature and with this entire creation? Yes. And that's spiritual. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, because spirit recreates, right?
I
always say recreation is recreation. which is also a spiritual thing.
Yeah,
To me, it's the intent that comes with it.
yeah.
We've had some great events where things are, casual from a ceremonial perspective, but it's about authenticity. It's about being yourself. It's being respectful to others, and, you know, have
And
fun. Have
also,
fun.
yeah, and
You know?
also set and setting, because like, so we would do that and we'd make music and again go around this bonfire and stuff. But there's a metalcore band that I really like. They're called Attila. Now, would I eat mushrooms and go to an Attila show? Absolutely not. No way, because that's not the right setting for that kind of experience. On the other hand, back in the day, I had friends. It's actually funny. One of them ended up becoming an NYPD, New York police officer. But I mean, we would go to New York hardcore shows, and he would eat mushrooms, and he'd be in the pit, like doing his whole thing while he's on mushrooms. I'm like, I ain't doing that. So, you
Right.
know, I think a lot of it has to do with, well, what can a person handle? What is the setting? What is the right setting for that person? Spiritual experiences are very individual because we all have different filters by which we bring in that larger, creative consciousness. So you have to know what's right for you, and making any kind of blanket statement about, oh, well, you shouldn't go to, a heavy metal show or a hardcore show and take mushrooms. I knew people in New York that did that all the time. I wouldn't do it, but they would do it. Whereas when we would go up to Lake George and do it kind of on our more like hippie, tree hugging, flower child way, those guys, they weren't into that at all. So, it depends on, they would probably have a bad experience doing that. Whereas me, I mean, I loved it. So you have to know what's right for you, and you have to listen to your intuition, because it is speaking to you, and just, hone into yourself in these regards. Don't become a self-centered jerk. I'm not saying that, but when it does come to medicine work, you do have to listen to yourself and listen to your own soul.
Yeah, beautifully said. And not just in the medicine work, in life, like to really tune into that intuition and not doubt it. I can speak for myself. I've been a doubter, and then all of a sudden it's like, no, I got to listen to that. Whether it's the voice or it's that feeling in your solar plexus, whatever that is, there's something to be said to intuition just as a whole. So thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. Look, I'm named after the great doubter of Western civilization, Doubting Thomas.
Doubting Thomas.
So I feel you on that. I know what you're talking about. But again, like for me, because I have a very defined spiritual connection to these medicines, I mean, I have no doubt at all.
Yeah, me neither. That I can guarantee. And I've had some pretty powerful experiences with no medicine. And one thing I was thinking, when you were talking about, spirit and that kind of work, you don't necessarily choose when spirit's going to come and tap on your shoulder and say, here I am, you can now see me. People have those moments in some very, very, unique circumstances and timings of their life where, like you had described when they were using, talking about LSD and alcohol and alcoholics, where the one fellow who kind of saw, he said he just saw it. All of a sudden the light came in and he wasn't under the influence of anything. And he became a believer, which is what changed his connection to alcoholism and being an alcoholic. Is just, you never know when that's going to strike you.
Yeah, that actually goes back to the whole conversation we were having earlier. I should have brought it up earlier, but when they were treating alcoholics with LSD, the whole point was to induce what are called delirium tremens in the person, which is, this awful withdrawal symptoms from, when you get off of alcohol. And instead of that happening, these guys were having spiritual experiences, and that's what got them off alcohol. So there was, what was it? The Board of Alcoholism, I believe, if it was I don't remember if it was in Vancouver or in all of Canada, but they called LSD the most helpful remedy they'd ever seen. And again, not because they were inducing delirium tremens, but they were inducing mystical experiences. So again, going back to that whole idea that in my opinion, that's what these medicines are actually used for. That's what people have used them for thousands of years. And that's really, I mean, I conclude my book pretty much making that argument to say, if the 1950s taught us anything, it's that these medicines are not weapons. You cannot weaponize them in any useful way. You can turn them into medicines and spiritual tools, and that seems to work just fine.
Wow, what a great segue, because it's hard to believe we've already been chatting for an hour. I feel like
That's
we could
it?
talk about, I
I
know,
thought we were
right?
talking like 5 minutes or so.
I know. Well, that's when you know you're on a great topic and you're really in the zone, because, again, your book's just full of great information based on the history of the research. And to me, it was fascinating. Like I say, I learned a lot in reading your book, and I've read enough and I've heard enough presentations over the number of years. But I'm always fascinated to always learn more. And the history of these things are always fascinating. And, you started off talking about Hofmann, saying whatever propelled him to go back to this thing after 5 or 6 years, when these things are basically shelved and they never go back to it again. Which leads me to the same questions, like, how did they ever discover ayahuasca or combo or 5-MeO and things like that, when spirits talking and this tapping you on the shoulder and telling you something, the shamans of the jungles, they listen.
Yeah, like you bring up a really excellent point, Mark. It was like with, let's just take 5-MeO DMT. Who was the person that saw the medicine coming out of the toad and went, I'm going to smoke that?
Yeah, exactly.
Who would have thought it? And with ayahuasca, you ask the ayahuasqueros and they'll tell you, oh, the plants told us, because you're like, well, how did you know to mix, the Banisteriopsis capi vine with the chacruna leaf? And they'll say, oh, but they told us to do so. I mean, it's like we are tapping into a consciousness, and I just that is for me extraordinary. That is something that is like what people have always been seeking out through different meditation, yoga, in combination with things like cannabis or mushrooms or whatever. That's what people have always been seeking out. I mean, like it or not, we are a spiritual species. We just are. And I understand that not everybody has a spiritual dimension. I mean, I went through a period of my life when I was an atheist, but it got to a point where I felt kind of fraudulent. The new atheists, guys like Daniel Dennett, the late Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, they'll always bring up how, there are all these people sitting in church pews that are atheists and feel like, they need to be there for their, because of their family or community. How will people look at them? And they're these kinds of frauds. Well, I'm on the other side of that. During the period when I went through a very brief period of atheism, I felt like a total fraud. I felt like this does not speak to me at all. I've had too many experiences with mushrooms and now with ayahuasca and with 5-MeO DMT that I cannot deny that there is something much greater going on in this cosmic dance that we're all a part of.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, very well said, Tom. And I feel the same way through just experience. And, one thing for me, I remember having it was a meditation in 2007, a 5,000-year-old Indian meditation that completely changed my life. And, as I went through just a bunch of learning and practice and experience, and then to be reintroduced into the world of psychedelic medicines, and first it kind of came back recreationally, and someone said, oh, mushrooms. I was like, really? They still exist? I haven't seen those in ages. And next thing you know, down the rabbit hole I went. And as I started learning more how they're being used for, from trauma and depression, addiction, and so many other ailments, that I got really curious. And it just led me down this path to where we are here today, many years later. And I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to be able to share the work of what I consider the masters in this. And you're one of those guys, because you bring such great practical knowledge historical knowledge. And I love history. I think that's one of the things you and I have in common. And that's why I found the book so fascinating to read, because you also made it very readable. And for anybody watching out there, if you're interested, get the book. It's, I'm not going to say it's an easy read in the sense that, you know, there's a lot of names, a lot of dates and things like that, but it kept me intrigued from beginning to end. And that to me is always a judge of a good book, especially when you start getting into things of a clinical nature, research nature. So I just want to say, Tom, well done in bringing it all together and answering a lot of questions and filling in some of the blanks that we don't hear everywhere else.
Sure. I'm curious if that, because you're right, we have been doing this for an hour. I'm wondering if anyone has any questions.
Well, we do have Jillian in the room. Jillian, if you have any questions, you can turn your camera on and ask Tom a question before we wrap up our session today. And I've posted a few things on our live stream and our membership portal, and I haven't had anybody come back with any questions. So I think we probably covered a lot. And but if Jillian, if you have any questions, you can certainly pop your camera on and we'll be happy to answer your questions. But yeah, Tom, great work on the book is the one thing I just want to say. And I encourage everybody to, you know, if you're interested in more of the history of this very, very interesting discovery by Albert Hofmann, then, you know, this is the go-to recommendation that I have. And I thank you for mentioning and telling your story about SBMC. It just made me laugh because I was there. That's when we met, and I could just picture that whole event for you in my mind, which really brought it home.
Thanks. Okay.
All right. So we have no other questions, but I feel that I could be talking to you for forever. Oh, we do have a question. Hello.
I'm just speaking on behalf of Jillian and I. Tyler,
yes.
I sat in. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the talk. It's been immensely educational and informative and enlightening. Thank you so much.
Oh, absolute
Great.
pleasure.
Well, thank you for
Sorry if I
joining
get a
us.
little loud at times. I just like talking about this stuff, and I get excited.
Hey,
All good. It was wonderful.
yeah, and for me, you never have to apologize for that, Tom, because again, like I say, I love authentic conversations. You know, it's a conscious conversation. We're here, we're authentic, we're being real. And to me, that's the most important way of being, and is a great example for others to be their authentic selves at every stage in their life and speak your truth.
Well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, I always love talking to you. We always have such great conversations, so I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. And anytime you want to connect and share your work, you know, you always have a, you know, an outlet here with Spirit Plant Medicine. We're always happy to share what you're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, likewise.
Fantastic. Well, without further ado, then we're going to let everybody go, and I'll let you get back to your evening. I know you're a busy guy today, and thanks again for taking the time with us this evening, Tom.
Absolutely, Mark. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Always my pleasure.